Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of Rebooting. Today we have a very special guest who is an internationally renowned cybersecurity expert, and he advises governments around the world, works in universities, comments in the press, and is a real pleasure to have on today. So welcome Alan Woodward.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very, very much for coming. So everyone will expect me to ask you this question. How would your family describe what you do for a living?
Rather depends which one you ask. If you ask the children, it's something to do with computers. If you ask my wife, I'm basically tech support for the house. But mostly I think they if somebody says, "Oh, what does he really do?" It's that he breaks computers. He makes computers do things they shouldn't do. So that's basically that's my skill, you see. So that's.
And you are also a physicist. That's correct, isn't it?
That's how I started. Yes, I started as a baby physicist. So actually, if you look at the various letters after my name, it's slightly confusing because I am a physicist and an engineer and indeed a statistician as well. So if I go to parties and people want to know what I do, and I don't want to talk to them, I say I'm a statistician, and then they disappear off. They go, "Oh, very interesting," and then they disappear off to the side of the room. So
we're going to talk about insider threats today, and I think I want to sort of start with the fact that this is a topic that should get a lot more coverage than it does. And we've seen some really high profile insider threat cases in the last couple of years. We've had Tesla, we've had Google, we've had Facebook, we've had Amazon, and obviously the pharmaceutical companies as well with the vaccine and things like that as well. So why do you think we shy away from talking about it as much as we do?
Well, I think there's this idea that when people are talking about security and particularly cyber security, that somehow there's somebody from outside is going to try and break in to our systems. And we do have a bit of a tendency to think technology. I mean, in fact, the first thing I ever start off talking to students about is you've got to think about security as the triad of people, processes, and technology. And if anything, if you look at it, something like 95% of successful penetrations involve humans. It's the old picnic problem, problems in the chair, not in the computer. So you've got to think about people in that loop. And when you think about it, the people with the most access are the ones inside, not outside. So it behooves you well to actually consider all options. I had a very interesting case recently with British Airways, for example, where you all have seen they had that Mage card attack, and indeed the ICO has now fined them. And it was a sort of a pseudo insider attack, in that what they hadn't realized was that somebody who'd been granted access to various bits of their systems, their credentials had been stolen. So somebody was impersonating them. So quite often people don't throw the net quite wide enough to actually think about all the possibilities about how someone got in, because they might already effectively be in. There's a lot of temptation out there. Plus, if you look at some of these big names out there, they don't want their own personal reputation to suffer. So somebody breaking in, that's kind of one thing. But having somebody on the inside that's, doing something wrong, that kind of rubs off on the corporate image. But at the same time, they are huge. I mean, when you think about how many hundreds of thousands of people work there, there's bound to be a few bad apples or disgruntled employees. They didn't get their pay rise or their bonus, so they're going to sell some IPR to the opposition, or whatever it happens to be. We let's face it. We've had people like Snowden with the highest clearances, on the inside, doing the most damage. Other intelligence services would have given the right teeth for what he then sort of walked out the door with. So it shows that they are a force multiplier that you really, really got to take care of.
Yeah, and I think it's uncomfortable because for many years, companies have wanted this sort of warm and fluffy image, haven't they, of this sort of inclusivity, and we're all a community, and that's great, and that's something that I do think is a very worthwhile thing to have as a culture. But then to sort of consider that your employees could be, in fact, the adversary runs very counter to that, doesn't it?
Well, the immediate thing that happens is people are going to say, well, they're not looking after their employees, or they're, you might have 100,000 employees and only one insider commits some sort of breach.
Right.
But people are naturally going to think, How many disgruntled employees have they got, and how on earth do they treat their employees if they get that badly disgruntled?
Yeah,
That
and
they
this was a
got.
bit like with Morrison's, wasn't it? And I know that the Supreme Court kind of overturned the Court of Appeal's decision on this and said, Morrison's wasn't liable for this. But in a sense, it's quite a difficult case to reconcile in your mind, because in some respects, Morrison's gave this person access, and then this person misused the access. But then it's a difficult situation where we say, well, Morrison's isn't responsible for that misuse of the access. Do you see what I mean?
Well, yes. I mean, but it's interesting. At a few cases I've been involved in, where the corporations, the body corporate, that they are vicariously liable for what their employees do, because when you work for a company, that is what a company is, a company of people, and so there is an element of them trying to distance themselves from that sort of responsibility. But if something is that important and you can give someone that much responsibility, then maybe you need to be looking back at the processes and looking at the sort of the 4 eyes rule, and should there be 2 people there at any one time, so that you don't vest all that responsibility. The whole corporate responsibility is vicariously then lodged in one person that has super duper privileges on the networks, for example. Maybe that's not the best idea in the world, but it's a leftover from the early days of networks, where the sort of sysadmins were the forgotten gods of IT. They could do anything they wanted, and people just forgot about it. And that's carried on to this day, where as you've abstracted up layers, people have been given more and more access and privileges to the real nuggets, the data, and people don't necessarily even know if their data has been stolen, because they don't have the processes in place to know whether something's been copied, for example.
Right.
So,
and I think
that's a real problem.
And I think this is kind of how the insider threat has become more of a problem, in a sense, because if we sort of go back in time to a point where, in reality, if you wanted to steal something either from, the government or from your employer or whoever it was you're working for, you would have to physically access that document, that paper document. You would then have to take it to a photocopier, I presume, photocopy it, take those copies, put those in your bag, put it back, and then walk out without anybody noticing, right? So A, there's a lot more risk to being caught. But B, the amount of data is small, right? Because in the Tesla case, it was gigabytes of data. Now, if you imagine the paper version of that,
oh yeah,
that's suitcases and suitcases full of data that you're lugging out.
Take you years to exfiltrate that from an organization. But also, I mean, in certain establishments I've worked in, I mean, you can be searched on the way out. And so there's always the risk of being caught. So it's high risk, as you said, whereas now with electronic links, it can be sent backwards and forwards. And there's an element of plausible deniability about it, in that it's not, you can't always say, first of all, you don't know if it's been copied, but secondly, who copied it and who sent it out? And there are various means of sending it out in disguise as well, whether it's steganographic techniques these days. We've seen quite a lot of data being exfiltrated increasingly. I'm part of a group that's set up by Europol, where we're looking at the criminal use of information hiding. And increasingly, people are using some fairly sophisticated techniques to, sneak stuff out. And these days, corporates with their corporate networks, they're used by individuals and employees for quite a lot of, I guess you would call it personal. Yeah, they might use their work email to send pictures of their kittens or whatever to granny. But how do you know there's not something in that picture?
Right.
There's that you need to, perhaps people need to start understanding a little bit more about how it can be done in order to look to see if it is being done.
Right. And I think on the side of that, even if you didn't have the skill to do it in that manner, if you are allowed to sit in front of your computer with your smartphone and photograph the screen with your smartphone, and then go out and send on your 4G network, send that image out, I presume really nowadays with social networking, to anyone, anywhere in the world instantly, that poses a real threat. And I think, I've worked in the police, I've worked in environments where you're not allowed phones or electronic devices. And I know that many people view that as way too far away. But in some companies that are working with very sensitive data, or data that could be used to manipulate markets, or data that, you know, intellectual property and R&D data, do you think we need to start getting it, you know, borrowing those techniques that governments and military and intelligence services already employ for those employees?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, and they're not difficult. They are things like, you know, you have a little lockbox and you put your phone in, and you're not allowed to take media in and out of, you know, electronic media in and out of the establishment without a special permit. And, you know, you put anything that can transmit or receive into a little lockbox before you go through the turnstiles. And indeed, if you work in some government buildings, it will detect if you've got a phone on you. It will detect the transmissions, and an alarm will go off, so they know if you're walking in with it or not. But if something's that important, then really, yeah, you should be doing that. But the other slight problem with this is that we all sit in front of computers like we are today, and they're sort of general purpose portals. You know, in the good old days when everything was on paper and you would go and see something that was classified in government, for example, you wouldn't typically have that on a desk and be in a room where you had it mixed up with all sorts of other papers. You know, you would go, you would sign for it, you would read it. You certainly weren't allowed to copy it. But what I think happens now is you give people access electronically. And so depending on their username and their password, they may have to log in again or whatever, but on the same screen, they can see things of great value to a business, as well as the mundane, you know, the memos about, you know, fire drills or whatever it happens to be. So there needs to be an element of segregation, perhaps. People don't necessarily realize that the information, they think the information is segregated, but of course, when it's in front of my eyeballs on my screen, it's not. It's all there. And as you say, you only need to do something as simple as, you know, pick your phone up and take a picture of it. And that's as good as a photocopy, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose that brings us into this new situation, because now we're in this work from home environment for who knows how much longer, hopefully not that much longer, but you never know. And now you've lost that in that typical open plan office environment. You know, one could maybe argue that if someone was sitting there holding their mobile phone and sort of just scrolling and recording everything, it might be obvious and someone might challenge that. And I suppose that is an argument. But now we don't have that. That visibility is completely gone. I very much doubt people have got their employee laptops webcams turned on permanently, because I think that would be a serious violation of employee privacy.
Yeah.
So now what? How do we now kind of regulate that? Because also some people live in shared houses with people who you haven't vetted as a company.
No, absolutely. I think that the issue is what you're doing is you're extending the corporate boundary out to people's homes and onto people. I mean, in some cases, people are working on their home machines, so you've no idea of the health of that machine. So you might end up with this unintentional inside the thread. So let's suppose I'm working at home and people know I work on sensitive equipment. My home PC is a really good thing to target, because I'm, you know, if you can take screenshots and keystrokes off of my machine, you might get something very interesting that actually I would be working on normally in the office. It can be secured all the way. You can put all the encryption you like in place, but as soon as it gets to the endpoint, i.e. your PC, it's no longer encrypted, and that's the one place you go for it. So there is a problem, and things haven't necessarily been thought through. Everything's been done at speed, of course, and you can understand why. But again, people may be, and I'm not sure working at home is going to go back to people working in the office totally. I think it's a bit like, I was talking to one of my neighbors the other day, and he used to work 4 days in the office and 1 day at home, and now it's flipped around the other way. And I think there is almost a new normal coming. So again, it comes back to people, processes, and technology. Yes, have the technology to encrypt it whilst it's going backwards and forwards, but you know, talk to people, advise people to make sure they understand the problem of keeping, for example, data on their machine locally at home where it can be vulnerable. Because you know the old adage, if someone's got physical access to your machine, it's no longer your machine. So maybe people need to start to think a little bit more about, you know, maybe they should be working in virtual environments. So actually all they've got at home is a thin client, and actually the data never comes to their house. It's always actually kept there. It's visible, it's on the screen. You can still use the phone to take a screenshot of it. But at least you've kind of secured it from unintentional loss. You know, it's the old thing about in government, when we used to work in government and people would have classified laptops and leave them on the train. I mean, it's that kind of thing writ large because everybody's doing it. So I think a little bit of thought needs to go into the processes and maybe a little bit of the technology, because having those sort of thin clients at home that people can use, they're good, but they do take some investment because, of course, you've got to have the back end for that, and that takes money. So at the moment, everybody's thinking this is temporary. So what are we going to do? We're going to get people to use their own kit.
Yeah.
And of course, if it goes on too much longer, I mean, we've been at this now for a year. I'm lucky enough. I've had a jab already, but I'm one of the first waves to do that. I mean, we might get everybody having a jab by the end of the year. So restrictions are going to be in place for some time this year.
Yeah.
And I wouldn't be at all surprised if things don't, and people don't get used to a new normal. So rethinking processes, I think, is going to be important, and extending the education that goes with extending the corporate boundary, because people tend to think when they're given their cybersecurity training, it's quite interesting because we do it at the university like anywhere else. You tend to talk about inside the, when people are working on kit that, they work on in their daily life. And so the awareness goes up to the corporate boundary. I think now what we need to do is you need to think of the corporate boundary as much more virtual, because rather when you walk out the door at 7 o'clock at night or whatever it is, that isn't where your responsibility ends. You might actually have something at home that is potentially really targetable, or could make you liable as an individual. You need to get people to sort of buy into that to a certain extent.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that kind of makes me think a little bit more about, so for example, we had in the presidential election, both Trump and Biden talked about how China was becoming this issue for American enterprise and for American R&D and IP and everything, by putting people either into the companies and exfiltrating that data, or befriending people online and getting actual American employees to pass the data under whatever guise. I think the problem is some people see that as a risk for government and for military, but not a risk for companies. What do you sort of think about that and that kind of more sophisticated actor, I suppose, that is trying to get hold of that data?
I don't. It is something for governments, but I think it's something that people need to be made aware of. I mean, when you deal with classified information, which is the obvious thing they're going to be going after, everybody's, you get talked to every so often. People say, have you had any approaches from this, that, and the other? But actually, I mean, everybody overshares. Go to LinkedIn. People actually put their clearances on there now, I notice, which is just like, oh no. And they certainly talk about the sorts of things, that sorts of data they and who they work with. So it's a gift to somebody, to either industrial espionage or state-driven espionage, and in some cases they're the same thing. And there's a cultural thing as well here, because it's quite interesting that if you go to Shenzhen, for example, in China, and you talk to them about IPR, copyright, they think perhaps people are a little bit too precious about copyright, because they see innovation as standing on the shoulders of each other. So they see it as if somebody comes up with something, they see the idea of copying it as almost a compliment, because they can incrementally add to it and go up and up and up. So the idea, and it's quite interesting that places like China were some of the last to sign up to the Berne Convention on copyright, internationalizing copyright protections. So I think there are cultural differences around the world. And what you're going to find is that the mission, I think people find that the mission of some intelligence agencies is not just state secrets, but it's actually the economic well-being of the country. So what does that mean? That means why would you invest $1 billion in developing some new alloy for a fan blade for a new jet engine when actually you can go and steal the formula from someone else? So you've got to be very careful that there are a lot of crown jewels around there that we don't necessarily know. I mean, it's worth saying that the security services are very well aware of that, and they know what to protect, and they know where to look. But that's spreading out. So small to medium-sized businesses and some startups have some real nuggets in there, that they are going to, in 5-10 years, look at what happens in telecoms. I mean, 10 years ago in 5G telecoms, if you were developing something there, who would have thought it was worth anything? Now it could be, it could be worth billions. So governments are getting a lot more, how shall I say, aware. They're becoming a lot more aware. They're trying to make people aware of it as well, and businesses in particular. The big businesses that invest lots, they tend to be aware anyway, but smaller businesses might not always be. But there is a bit of a danger of you of getting annoyed as well, and sort of bringing the shutters down, say, right, we're not going to do business with that country or that country because they're stealing secrets. But practically speaking, you've got to, because the world is so globalized now. And what you need to do, you're better working with them. And when someone is overtly placing people into organizations, and that does happen, that you talk about the insider threat. Well, the insider threat, you might just have employed someone that's deliberately come into your business to steal secrets.
Right.
There's an element of, we're totally internationalized now, and you can't immediately say to somebody, I need to do a check on you. I need to vet you in the same way that, say, governments vet people who are going to handle classified information. But there's an element of that needs to go on if you're going to give them access to things that are really, really of value to the business. So it's tricky, because you can put talent off by saying, oh, you're going to be checked out. But at the same time, you do need to be aware of what you might be giving them access to and what they might then walk off with.
If you look at the sort of obvious example recently, which is the development of the vaccine, which is obviously, now out, but a few months ago was the hot, sort of, I guess it's the new gold or whatever you want to call it, that was sort of out, right? It was a very valuable asset that everyone was going after and wanted. There was a lot of accusations flying around that people had been approached on LinkedIn by suspect accounts and asked for information and things like that. And I think the other thing that I sort of wanted to pick your brains about was, how do we stop employees who are good, loyal, hardworking, no nefarious intent whatsoever from befriending somebody on social media and, unbeknown to them, getting fed a story that then ends up in them passing inadvertently, perhaps, information that is incredibly useful? Because in that situation, they don't have a malicious intent to harm the company necessarily, but have ended up in that position.
Unfortunately, the only way is education. And unless you're going to spy on your employees and see who they're talking to, who they're making friends with, which I think most people would think was a little step too far. It's about education, about the fact as soon as somebody, no matter how impeccable their credentials, in fact, the moment their credentials become impeccable, I would suggest that they probably need looking at. That you say to people, if you're dealing with this, you might be a target. I mean, you're handling the crown jewels for this company. So don't be surprised if you don't get some strange approaches and from directions. It's not going to be, I don't know, the equivalent of the romance scams that go on. I mean, it might very well be. I mean, I can't tell you how many connection requests I get on LinkedIn from people that are genuinely just interested in cybersecurity and want to connect. But then if you get a message and it says, oh, I've got something very interesting to talk about and let you know, blah, blah, blah. That's one thing. But then if they start asking questions, you've just got to teach people the sort of behavior I guess I once read about it called the 7 deadly sins. I mean, there are 7 traits in human behavior that we're all subject to, we're all liable to. So if particularly people that work in cybersecurity, or indeed science, technology, engineering in general, we're all inquisitive. So if you pique someone's interest, you'll quite often say, well, just tell me a little bit more about that. And then suddenly you find people are exchange, and then they say, well, how do you do it? And suddenly you start you don't realize you're getting nothing back, or you think you might be getting something, but it's worth 0, but you're giving away the state secrets. So just be terribly careful. And unfortunately, a lot of that's just education, and in the same way that people it's a bit of a laugh now that people say when they see the Nigerian prince emails come in, they sort of have a bit of a laugh about it. My daughter had it yesterday where somebody phoned up, incredibly thick Indian accent. Oh, you've got a virus on your machine, we're phoning from Microsoft, etc. And she actually sent me the video of herself in the car talking to the guy. And right to the point where he at the end, he said, you're just wasting my time now, aren't you? and they get really annoyed about it. But that's only because they're my kids and I've educated them to death about sort of, what to be
Yeah.
aware. You just got to, unfortunately, you just got to bang on about it. And in the same way that I suppose you might think of it as, it's not cyber security, but cyber enabled security. And telling them, it goes back to this: people, processes, and technology. So it's not just going to be that you've got to have the latest technology on your machine, you've got to have the latest versions, have the latest updates. Be aware that social engineering is still by far and away, by a country mile, the best way of getting information out of anybody. And you might think of signals intelligence organizations being the ones that hoover it all in, but actually the real nuggets come out of the human intelligence organizations, because they're the ones that get the real targeted, really juicy bits.
Yeah, and I think if you ever have a online relationship, whether that's professional, friendship, romantic, whatever, with somebody, and you discover that, and you look at the communication and you sort of think, I'm doing majority of the talking here, that should always be a red flag. Because I always say to people that, a conversation is a two-way thing, right? Unless you're interviewing somebody, it's a two-way discussion on an issue. And there should be broadly the same amount of conversation coming out of both parties. And if that's not the case, probably what's happening is that they're encouraging you to talk and talk and talk.
They're teasing you forward, and they're expert at it. That's their job. That's what they do. Human intelligence officers, they're very, very good at getting that social engineering. And after all, that's how they get people to say, going right back to the beginning, the good old days, how we used to break into organizations and you needed somebody's username and password. The most valuable bit of information you could have was the internal telephone directory. And so what we would do is we would phone around all the extension numbers, and you would start off exactly the same conversation. You would say, hi, I'm phoning from IT about the problem you reported. I've got a few minutes now to quickly help you. And the first 100 people you talk to, they say, no, I didn't lodge a problem. But the 100th person would genuinely have lodged a problem and would say, oh, thanks for phoning back. Instantly, they trust you because they think, oh, they're phoning me. So they say, oh, look, I haven't got access to it at the moment. Can you just give me a username and password so I can log in as you and see what the problem is? And people will do it because there's inherent trust. You can build. So that first deadly sin about, particularly the British, I have to say, we're overly deferential and we trust. And I would say that it goes back to in the same way that ABC applies to technology and processes, it really should apply to the personal things as well. So that's assume nothing, believe no one, and check everything. It sounds horribly cynical, but just think about the fact you don't know this person. You don't know. You might see a picture of them and you might read some words about them, but there could be a complete ghost. And you need to be incredibly careful because the backstories that are put into those people, there's a lot of effort goes into trying to tease that information out. It's worth their while doing it.
Yeah, because I think the problem that social networks have kind of created is that people who I've spoken to in the field of romance fraud particularly, but I think it probably does kind of map across to other threats as well. They feel that the person is in the UK. And when you ask them why they think that, they say, oh, well, all the messages have been in sort of English text. But they've never spoken to them on the phone. They've never heard their voice. They've never seen their face and seen a video. They've never seen photographs that are demonstrably going to be taken at that moment in time, i.e. proof that it's actually them and been taken.
There is no proof of life. There is no proof of life there. And in fact, when you break, with the work I do at Europol, one of the things we found quite a lot is that when those rings are broken up, it's not one person you're talking to at all. It's a room full of blokes who are all taking turns talking to you. And in fact, they've got, particularly when they're if say it's blokes, there's a picture of a very attractive man or a few pictures of a very attractive man. God knows where they got it from. Quite often they'll steal it anyway, and you find your identity is being used. But it's a whole series of people, and that they have like a house style guide of how to talk to them. But they'll be talking to 100 different women at once. So,
oh my gosh.
But the virtual environment makes people feel they're special and they're having a one-to-one conversation. And bingo,
it's
that's
not
the first
abnormal.
bit of trust.
It's not abnormal now to never converse with somebody over the telephone or even, seeing them or wanting to meet. Whereas when I was younger, that would be unheard of. Like that would be a sure sign of some sort of predator if they'd contacted you in a way where you hadn't been able to verify who they were or speak on the phone. And now, how many people have ever spoken to the people they converse with online?
It's actually got worse. It's actually got worse in lockdown because, of course, we're all used to doing this and talking on. I mean, video at least. You're a human being. I can just about prove that you're alive. But even that is getting difficult with deep fakes.
Right.
And we are seeing the beginnings of deep fakes being used to pretend to be someone else, someone stealing my avatar, and making it do whatever it wants. We've all seen the ones of Obama, saying things that he would never say, and it's not difficult to do it, and in real time. There's an Israeli system that does it in real time.
Do you think deep fakes are going to become a problem? Because I know the community is a little bit split on the actual utility of them. And at the moment, I know they're very difficult in the sense of they need an awful lot of data of you speaking or whatever in order to look realistic. But obviously things come on really fast in IT and in tech generally. So do you think that's going to pose a problem? And who is that going to pose a problem to? The population in general, or sort of high level celebrities and government officials?
Yes, it's definitely going to come on, and it's happening now. As I said, there's a piece of research come out of Israel, which was a real-time system, and all they needed was a single picture, and it really does look realistic. And wow. It's the learning, the model that they don't need anything like the model, the sort of the degree of data for learning, for the machine learning that they did before, and you can use it in a Skype call. So you could use it in a Zoom call like this. So it's going to be a problem for anybody. Now, if you're working in a highly protected environment like government, for example, you're probably going to be more aware of it, and you might see that initially. Certainly, you're going to see the crinkles around the edges. You're going to see it's a bit like when we put strange backgrounds on. We can always tell there's something not quite right about it. But give it a few years, nope, it's going to be a problem. And also, those who aren't expecting it, particularly people at home. So let's go back to the romance scam thing, or let's say I want to steal a secret from you, and you say, well, I tell you what, I'm really interested in this subject. Now let's just have a video call. So you do, and the person instantly trusts that you're real, you're alive, you're there. So you're not hiding anything, you're not pretending to be anything you're not, because you're having a video call. Imagine that, when you can't trust what you're seeing on the other end, and they're able to practice their social engineering techniques just as if they were with you in person.
It's quite terrifying, isn't it, when you think of it like that?
Absolutely. I mean, and for the criminals, of course, there's far less risk, because they're not meeting you in a pub and doing it there, or doing it over they could be sat on the other side of the world pretending to be down the road. And as I said, in lockdown, it's got a lot worse, because I've heard far more. There've been romance scams, for example, have been massively on the increase recently. And because people miss human contact, unless you're a curmudgeonly old git like me. I mean, you kind of,
or me.
People want to go and talk to people. They like talking to people. So, if they get a reason to have a video call or whatever, they view that as almost as good as, and certainly the younger generations, almost as good as going out and talking to people. So you can even have group conversations where people trying to steal information will set up forums where people will talk, and they'll all give their secrets away, they'll share them, and that person will be busily recording it and taking notes. So
and I guess actually on a big Zoom call with lots of people, your thumbnail is really, really small, probably quite low resolution anyway, so little glitches and things like that are probably not going to be noticed if they're not in sort of 4K on a massive, great big screen.
Exactly, and we're all used to that. That's the other thing about modern video. I mean, I've got such a dreadful link here where I live, in the middle of Wiltshire, and every so often my picture will freeze anyway. So you've got a situation where actually we're kind of used to sort of glitches and people suddenly talking like a Dalek. So it's as long as it doesn't last, people think, oh, that's just video calls. But they still see it as proof of life, and it's real, and they instantly trust it.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we can't keep talking about it as much as we would love to talk about it for the next 2 hours, which I'm sure we could. Where can people go to keep up with what you're doing and follow you and hear about the things you're writing about and things?
The main place that I pop up is on Twitter, Prof Woodward, or at Prof Woodward. And all the pointers are from there, really. So if I publish things, they'll be in all sorts of different journals. So I tend to talk about them there, or whether in the media, in the newspaper, or places like the BBC, I tend to put references to them on Twitter. So if people want to go there and follow me there, they'll see what's happening.
And all the links that we've talked about, including his Twitter handle, will be in the show links below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to avoid missing any other episodes. Thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. See you soon.